They laughed the moment she stepped off the wagon. Every single one of them. The ranchers, the shopkeepers, the women clutching their bonnets. All of them staring at Mara Whitlock like she was the punchline to a joke nobody asked to hear. Curvy, dusty, and trembling in boots that didn't quite fit, she stood in the middle of Coldridge Settlement with nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. And then the biggest, most feared man in the mountains stepped forward, looked her dead in the eyes, and said 5 words that stopped the world cold. She's the one I chose. But the is If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and every single minute is worth it. Chapter 1. The wagon came down from the ridge just after noon, and by the time its wheels hit the frozen mud of Coldridge's main road, half the settlement had already gathered to watch. Word had spread the way. Word always spread in a place like this. Fast, mean, and without asking permission. Rowan Creed, the mountain hermit himself, the man who hadn't spoken more than 40 words to any human being in 3 years, had sent away for a bride. A mail-order bride. The news had landed in Coldridge like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples hadn't stopped since. Nobody could quite believe it. Rowan Creed, of all people. I was the kind of man people whispered about but never approached directly. Stood 6'4" in his boots, with shoulders built like a barn door, and hands that had pulled a wolf off a calf barehanded, or so the story went. He didn't drink at the saloon, didn't gamble at the back tables, didn't tip his hat, and make small talk the way the other ranchers did. He came into town once every few weeks for supplies, paid what he owed in silence, and rode back up the mountain before anyone worked up the nerve to say something stupid to his face. 3 years of that. 3 years since his father had died and left him the homestead and 160 acres of unforgiving terrain that most men wouldn't touch on a bet. So when the letter came through Walt Pruitt's general store, because Walt doubled as the postal drop, the town gossip, and the settlement's unofficial town crier, it caused exactly the kind of commotion Rowan probably hadn't accounted for. Arrangement made. Woman arriving 4th week of November. Mara Whitlock, age 26, from Clement Falls. That was it. That was all the letter said, according to Walt, who absolutely had not read it before handing it over and absolutely told everyone in Coldridge its contents by supper time. Clement Falls. Nobody in Coldridge knew the place. Someone said it was a coal town east of the valley. Someone else said it was practically a ghost town. Either way, the name meant nothing. But the idea of Rowan Creed taking a wife meant everything, at least to the kind of people who had too much time and not enough to fill it with. Agnes Hartley had been the first one to say what most people were quietly thinking. A mail-order bride, she'd said, in that particular tone she used for things she found both fascinating and appalling. Lord, what kind of woman does a man like that end up with? And so when the wagon finally appeared at the top of the ridge road, maybe 30 people found themselves with urgent reasons to be standing near the main road at noon on a Tuesday. Mara Whitlock was the only passenger. She sat on the bench behind the driver, a wiry old man named Carver, who hauled supplies and, apparently, people, between Clement Falls and the mountain settlements twice a month. She had one trunk. It wasn't large. She had a coat that had been good quality once, maybe 5 or 6 winters ago, before the cold had bleached the color out of it and the wear had softened the elbows into something past saving. Her hat was plain brown wool, pulled low. Her hair, dark, almost black, was pinned up beneath it in a way that had probably looked tidy when she'd fixed it that morning and had slowly lost the argument with the wind over 30 miles of mountain road. She wasn't what anyone expected. People had imagined all kinds of things in the 3 weeks between Walt's announcement and the wagon's arrival. Desperate, plain, young, and foolish. The guesses had been varied, but none of them kind. The reality of Mara Whitlock was something none of them had put into their imaginings. She was a full-figured woman. There was no polite way around it in a settlement that didn't deal much in polite. With a round face and dark eyes that took in the gathered crowd, with an expression too controlled to be called calm and too steady to be called afraid. She was built solidly, the kind of woman who took up actual space in the world. And in the cold air with the wind cutting down from the peaks, she looked about as out of place as a parlor chair set in the middle of a sheep pasture. She saw them looking. Of course she did. 30 people don't exactly hide. Carver pulled the wagon to a stop, wrapped his reins, and climbed down without ceremony. He went around back and started unstrapping her trunk. Mara sat there for a moment longer than she needed to, and later, much later, she would admit she was trying to decide whether to get down or tell Carver to turn around and take her back. She got down. The step was higher than it looked, and she miscalculated, landing heavier on her right foot than she intended, and the mud squelched loud enough for the nearest 6 people to hear. Someone laughed, a short, sharp sound, immediately swallowed, and Mara straightened up and brushed the front of her coat and said nothing. Coldridge? She asked Carver, though she clearly already knew the answer. Cold as the name says, he replied, not looking at her, already hauling the trunk down. Helpful man. Mara looked at the crowd. The crowd looked back. Nobody said anything useful. A few people whispered to their neighbors. Young Tommy Pruitt, Walt's 16-year-old, said something to the boy next to him that made both of them laugh in that bright, cruel way. Boys that age laughed at things they thought were beneath them. Agnes Hartley had one hand pressed to the base of her throat, which was her habitual pose for situations she found outrageous. Darlene Voss, who ran the laundry and had the loudest voice in the settlement when she chose to use it, said, not quietly, "Well, that's the woman Rowan sent for." The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind people filled with their own conclusions. Mara had spent 26 years accumulating silences like that one. She knew exactly what it meant. She had been too heavy since she was 12 years old, and the world had made very sure she understood what it thought about that, in ways large and small and sometimes spectacular in their cruelty. Teachers who arranged seating and somehow always put her in the back. Neighbors who stopped inviting her to things. A man in Clement Falls, she didn't let herself think his name anymore, who had told her she ought to be grateful anyone looked at her at all, and who had said it the way people said things they believed were simple truths. She knew what Darlene's silence meant. She knew what the whispers meant. She knew what Tommy Pruitt's laugh meant. She was looking for Rowan Creed. She'd seen a photograph, a small, cheap one, taken at a photographer's studio in some town east of here, probably on the same day he'd signed the arrangement papers. He'd looked uncomfortable in it, the way people who didn't get their photograph taken often looked. Stiff, slightly annoyed, somewhere between resigned and defiant. But she had noted the face. Strong jaw, dark eyes, a beard that wasn't decorative, the particular set of his shoulders that the photograph had managed to capture, even though it had tried to make him look respectable. She didn't see him in the crowd. For one terrible, stomach-dropping moment, she thought he wasn't coming. That this was the whole of it. She would step off a wagon into a town full of strangers who already hated her, and the man who had sent for her simply hadn't bothered to show up. And then the crowd shifted. People moved, not all at once, but in the way people moved when something behind them required more space than it was currently being given. And Rowan Creed walked through the gap between them like a man walking through his own kitchen, with no particular hurry and no acknowledgement that 30 people watching him was anything worth adjusting himself for. He was bigger in person. The photograph had lied about the scale of him. He wore a coat that had seen serious work, thick dark wool, trail dusted, and a hat that he'd clearly owned long enough to stop thinking about. His beard was fuller than the photograph suggested. He walked with the unhurried, ground-eating stride of a man who spent most of his life covering terrain and had stopped wasting energy on anything decorative. He stopped maybe 6 feet from Mara. He looked at her, not the way the crowd had looked at her, that sideways, assessing, almost offended look that people gave things they found wanting. He looked at her the way a person looked at something they were actually trying to understand. Direct. Deliberate. And something else that Mara, in that first moment, couldn't quite name. The crowd had gone quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Waiting. Rowan said, "You're Mara Whitlock." It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. Something happened in his face. Not a smile, she would have called it a smile, but it wasn't quite. More like the particular settling of features that happens when something confirms what a person already suspected. Then he turned around, turned to face the crowd. Took his time letting his eyes move across them, settling on no one and everyone at once, and said 5 words, low and plain, and carrying in the cold air with the absolute certainty of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. "She's the one I chose." Nobody laughed. Not Tommy Pruitt, not Darlene Voss, not Agnes Hartley, whose hand was still at her throat. Nobody. Rowan turned back to Mara, looked at her trunk on the ground, and said, "I'll get that." He picked it up without ceremony and started toward where his horse stood hitched at the rail near the general store. And after a single breath, in which Mara made a decision she couldn't entirely explain even to herself, she followed him. Behind them, Coldridge Settlement started talking all at once. Chapter 2. The ride up to Rowan's homestead took the better part of 2 hours. He had a second horse, a sturdy bay mare with a calm disposition, which Mara understood he'd brought down specifically for her. This was not discussed. He tied her trunk to his own horse's saddle in a configuration that looked impractical and held anyway, and Mara climbed onto the bay without being helped and without making it a moment. They didn't talk much on the way up. This surprised her, and it didn't. She had known, in the way you could know things from letters, even through all the awkwardness of letters written between strangers who were going to be married, that Rowan Creed was not a man who felt the need to fill silence. He had written to her 3 times in the 2 months between the initial arrangement and her departure from Clement Falls. The letters had been short, factual. He had described the homestead, the elevation, the acreage, the condition of the structures, the livestock. He had told her winters were hard, the nearest doctor was a 3-hour ride in good weather, and that he expected her to make her own judgments about what she could and couldn't handle. He had not told her what he expected in a wife, which she had found both unusual and, quietly, a relief. She had written back twice. She had been honest, more honest than was probably wise for a woman who didn't have a lot of options. She had told him she was heavy, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, that she'd worked her family's farm until her father died, that she could cook and preserve food and handle animals, but that she had never done serious high-altitude work. She had told him she was not looking to be saved and was not expecting to save anyone else. He had written back one more time. 3 sentences. That's a fair accounting. I'm not much for pretending either. The arrangement stands. That was the whole of it. So the quiet on the mountain road was not unexpected. What was unexpected was how it didn't feel like hostility. With most men Mara had known, silence was loaded. It meant disapproval or disinterest or the particular punishment of being ignored. Rowan's silence was different. It felt more like the silence of a person who was simply occupied with thinking and didn't feel obligated to interrupt that for the sake of social comfort. He did speak once, when the road bent around a rock face and the valley spread out below them, the settlement tiny and geometric far down, the river a silver thread through the brown and gray of the valley floor. "Whole thing looks smaller from up here," he said. She wasn't sure if he meant the settlement or something else. "It does," she said. They didn't speak again until they reached the homestead. The Creed homestead sat at around 6,000 feet, tucked against a southern-facing slope that caught the sun in a way the surrounding peaks didn't allow in many places. It was not beautiful in any picture postcard sense. The main house was solid, log construction, heavy beams, double-chinked walls that had been maintained carefully. But it had not been built for prettiness. It had been built to last. The barn was larger than the house, which Mara noted without comment as something that told her what a man prioritized. There was a root cellar, a smokehouse, a chicken coop that had seen better days, and a structure she couldn't immediately identify that turned out later to be where Rowan kept the dogs. 2 enormous, gray-coated animals who came out to investigate her with the same deliberate energy their owner possessed. "Do they bite?" she asked. "Not usually," Rowan said. One of them pushed its head under her hand without being invited. She scratched behind its ear. It leaned into her with the dead weight of a very large dog that had decided someone was acceptable. "What are their names?" Rowan hesitated. The hesitation was interesting. The first thing she'd seen that seemed to cost him something. "Fletcher and Dunn." "After people?" "After people," he confirmed, not offering more. She didn't ask. He showed her through the house with the same economical efficiency as everything else about him. Here was the kitchen. Here was where the wood was kept. Here was the root cellar access. Here was the bedroom. He said this with no particular inflection, as though it were just another room, and then stood in the doorway with his arms folded while she took in the space. It was plain. A bed, solid wood frame, decent mattress from the feel of the edge when she pressed it. A wardrobe. A window with real glass, which up here at this elevation was not nothing. "I'll take the loft," he said, "until you want otherwise." Mara looked at him. He looked back. Waiting, she realized, for her to find something objectionable in the arrangement. When she didn't, he nodded once, like that was settled, and went back through the kitchen. Mara stood in the bedroom for a moment alone. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was better than she'd expected. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the grain of the floorboards, and let herself feel, privately and fully, the thing she had been holding at arm's length since the wagon rolled out of Clement Falls 3 days ago, which was the compound terror of a decision that could not be undone, arriving in a place that had already made clear she wasn't wanted, and having to find a way to survive in it anyway. She'd been terrified before. She knew what it felt like. It felt like this. She sat with it for about 2 minutes. Then she heard something heavy, an iron shift in the kitchen. Rowan moving the kettle. She identified it eventually. And she stood up, unpinned her hat, and went to find where he kept the coffee. Chapter 3. The first 3 weeks were a careful, almost formal negotiation conducted mostly in shared tasks. There was plenty of work, which helped. The homestead ran on effort. There was no slack in it, no hour of the day that didn't have something requiring attention. Animals at dawn, wood before the temperature dropped, checking traps in the afternoon, inventory of the root cellar that Mara undertook on her own initiative, and that Rowan came in to find her hip deep in, rearranging with a system that she explained to him in terms he didn't argue with. He worked. She worked. They ate at the same table. They said what needed saying and not much else. But Mara watched. She was very good at watching. She'd learned early that in any new situation, watching first and talking second was how you survived. She watched how Rowan moved through the homestead, what he checked first in the morning, where his attention went when he was thinking. She watched how he was with the dogs, which was notably gentler than how he was with most things. She watched how he handled the horses. Competent, confident, but with a patience that was real, not performed. She watched, and she started to understand things. I was not, she decided in the second week, a man who had arranged for a mail-order bride because he wanted a servant. She had been prepared for that, had built internal defenses against it during the 3 days of travel, had decided precisely what she would and would not accept. But it wasn't that. He did not give her orders. He said things like, "The south fence line needs checking this week, if you wanted to go." Not go check the fence. He said, "I made enough stew for 2. Not here's your food. Small distinctions. The kind of distinctions that most people never noticed until they'd lived long enough in situations where those distinctions mattered." She started to understand, too, why he'd done it. Not what he'd written in the letter, though she believed he'd been as honest as he knew how to be, but the why beneath the why. A man this solitary, this self-sufficient, this genuinely at home in the silence. He hadn't sent for a bride because loneliness was eating him. He could have lived here alone for 40 more years and made peace with it. She suspected he had sent for her because there was something in the homestead that was wrong without another person in it. Not empty, wrong, like a load-bearing wall that had been missing long enough that everything had quietly tilted. She didn't tell him this. She wasn't sure he would have known what to do with that information. Coleridge's opinion of the whole arrangement did not improve. Mara went down the mountain for the first time at the end of the second week, accompanying Rowan on a supply run. She had known it would be unpleasant. She had not entirely predicted the specific texture of the unpleasantness. It wasn't violent. Nothing so direct. It was the quality of silence when she entered a space, conversation pausing a beat too long before resuming. It was the way Walt Pruitt's wife asked, sweetly and terribly, if Mara was settling in all right, the emphasis on settling in carrying the clear implication that anyone could see she shouldn't have. It was Darlene Voss telling someone else, loudly enough, that some men just have different standards, and the laughter that followed. Mara bought what she needed and said nothing. Rowan heard Darlene's comment. She knew he heard it because she saw the specific stillness that moved through him, a quality of not moving that was different from ordinary stillness, the kind that preceded things. But he didn't do anything. He paid for his goods, he loaded the saddlebags, and when they were back on the horses and heading up the mountain road, he said, out of nowhere, "Darlene Voss has been mean-spirited since she was 9 years old, according to my father, who went to school with her. It's not personal." Mara looked at him. "It's a little personal." He considered this. "Fair," he said, and that was that. She appreciated that he hadn't told her not to let it bother her. That was what people usually said. Don't let it bother you. As though the point was about control, as though if you just tried harder to not feel a thing, you'd succeed. Rowan hadn't said that. He just offered the context and let her carry it however she wanted. Chapter 4. It was in the fourth week that things shifted. The shifting happened because of a predator problem. A mountain lion that had been working the area for about a fortnight, hitting smaller homesteads further south before turning north. Rowan had known it was out there. He'd found tracks and sign, and he'd set a pattern of checks that Mara had incorporated into her own daily routine without being asked. She found the first clear indication of the lion's territory shift on a Tuesday morning, doing the early check of the far pen. There was a ewe dead against the fence. Not taken, but killed, which was unusual. Mountain lions took what they killed. This one had killed and left, which meant either it had been disturbed or it was sick, or something else had frightened it off. She followed the tracks. She should not have done this alone. She knew that even as she was doing it, the knowing sitting alongside the doing in the same way it always did when she made decisions that were arguably unwise but felt immediately necessary. The tracks led east, away from the main buildings, into the heavier timber where the slope got steep and the ground was hard with frost. She followed them for about 3/4 of a mile before she heard Rowan behind her. She'd been so focused she hadn't heard him come up. "The tracks turn here," she said, without turning around, because she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't been doing exactly what she'd been doing. He came up beside her, looked at the ground. He was carrying the long rifle. She had the smaller one from the house, the one she'd found in the rack and asked him about on her third day. He'd said, "You know how to use it?" She'd said, "Yes." He'd said, "All right then. Tracks turn east," he confirmed. He studied the ground the way she'd been studying it, that same particular focused attention. Then he looked at her. "You followed these alone." "I did." "Through heavy timber." "Yes." His jaw moved. She had learned by now that this was where other people's emotion went. Into his jaw, into that brief tightening. He wasn't angry exactly. He was something more complicated than angry. "If you're going to tell me not to do that," she said, "you should know that I will probably do it again." "I wasn't going to tell you not to do it," he said. "What were you going to say?" He looked back at the tracks. "I was going to say you should have the rifle out when you're in the timber, not slung." She looked at the rifle in her hands, slung, exactly as he said, which had been stupid. "Yes," she said. "You're right." They tracked the lion together for another mile before Rowan determined it had moved on, the tracks heading south again, back toward territory it knew. They turned back toward the homestead. On the way back, with the cold working its way through her coat in the way it did in the later morning when the wind came down from the peaks, Mara said, "How long have you been on this mountain?" "Born here," Rowan said. "My father built the homestead. I've left, came back." "Why did you come back?" Another jaw movement. Thinking or deciding how much to give. There wasn't anywhere else that made sense. She thought about that for a while. The timber thinned and the homestead came into view below them. The dark line of the roof, the animals moving in the pen, Fletcher and Dunn's gray shapes near the barn door. "That makes sense to me," she said. He glanced at her. Not a long look, sideways, brief, the way he looked at things he was assessing without wanting to be seen assessing. "You miss where you came from?" Clement Falls. The coal dust in the air and the low gray sky, and the house that had stopped being a home 2 winters ago, and the faces of people who had known her all her life and made her feel like she was always doing it wrong somehow. "No," she said honestly. "Not particularly." They didn't speak again until they reached the barn. But something had changed. She felt it in the way that you could feel weather changing before the visible signs arrived. Something in the air, some shift in pressure that didn't have a name yet, but that was real. Chapter 5. The thing nobody in Coldridge wanted to consider was that Mara Whitlock was quietly extraordinary at staying alive in places that were trying to kill her. Not obviously, not dramatically. She didn't perform competence for an audience. There was no audience. There was just the mountain, every day, with its specific and unforgiving demands, and Mara met those demands with the same steadiness she brought to everything. Not easily, not always, but consistently. She learned to read the frozen ground for water. Rowan had shown her once, the way the frost patterns told you where the underground flow was, and she had filed the information and gone back out and tried it herself 5 times before she trusted her eye. By the end of the first month, she was better at it than she had any right to be. She rebuilt the chicken coop. This she did entirely on her own, over 3 days, using materials from the barn and a technique she had worked out from first principles and sheer stubbornness. The result was not beautiful. It was, however, airtight, predator-resistant, and significantly warmer than what had been there before. Rowan walked around it once, touching the corners, checking the latch. He said, "This is good work." It was the most plainly positive thing he had said to her. She held it carefully, the way you held something that might be more fragile than it looked. She learned the traps, where they were set, how they were set, the rotation schedule Rowan used. She took over half the trap line by the end of the first month, managing it without being asked and without making it into a presentation. She checked them, reset them, recorded what she found in the small notebook she'd started keeping in her coat pocket. Rowan found the notebook once, she'd left it on the kitchen table, and looked through it with an expression she couldn't read. "You're mapping the trap line," he said. "I'm mapping all of it. The water, the shelter spots for the animals, where I've seen predator sign. It helps me remember." He turned the pages carefully. "This is useful," he said, which was apparently what he said when something was more than useful, but he didn't have the vocabulary for more than useful. She started understanding what had happened to him. Not the full story. She didn't have the full story yet, but the shape of it. He had been alone too long, not in the way that made people desperate for company, but in the way that made them forget how to receive anything from another person without it feeling like something they needed to account for. He was not, she realized slowly, afraid of her. He was wary of what it meant to rely on someone. Those were different things, very different. She didn't push it, she just kept doing what she did. She was good at that, at existing in a space without demanding that it conform to her, at waiting for things to become what they were actually going to be, rather than forcing them into a shape they weren't ready for. The first time he laughed, she almost fell off the stool she was sitting on. It was a Thursday evening. She had been attempting to describe an incident from her childhood, a poorly planned effort to teach herself to ride a horse that had ended badly and publicly, and she had gotten to the part involving the fence post and the bucket of water, and Rowan, who had been sitting across the table with his hands around his coffee cup, had made a sound that started as something controlled and ended as genuine, full laughter. It didn't last long, maybe 3 seconds, but it was real. He caught himself, looked at her. His face held an expression she didn't have a name for. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "It was funny. It was objectively funny. I've come to terms with it." "Were you hurt?" "My dignity was destroyed. My body was fine." She considered. "My dignity had already been through worse." He was quiet. Then, "You do that." "Do what?" "Talk about hard things like they're just things." She thought about this. "I suppose they are eventually," she said. "Hard things don't stop being true just because you make them smaller. They just stop taking up so much room." He looked at his coffee cup. "I don't know how to do that." "I know," she said. And she didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like something she understood. That night, later, she heard him in the loft. The particular rhythm of a person awake when they shouldn't be. The small sounds of a sleepless hour. She lay in the bedroom and listened to the wind working on the roof, and didn't wonder what he was thinking, because she had a fair idea, and because some things needed their time in the dark before they were ready for daylight. She had been on the mountain for 6 weeks when she rode into Coldridge alone for the first time. She had a list from Rowan, supplies he needed, and she had the bay mare and a gray morning that was trying to decide between overcast and actual snow. She made it down without incident and tied the horse at the rail in front of Walt's store. Word moved fast, as it always did. By the time she came out of the store with the first load, Darlene Voss was on the boardwalk across the road with 2 other women whose names Mara had been told, but had decided not to bother remembering, and all 3 of them were looking at her with that particular combination of curiosity and contempt that certain people had elevated to an art form. "Creed let you off the mountain?" Darlene called over. Mara put the bundle in the saddlebag. "He's got things to do," she said. "Still there, then." It was phrased like a surprise. "Still there," Mara confirmed, and went back inside for the second load. She heard Darlene say something to the women beside her, heard the laughter that followed, felt it hit her in the specific place that kind of laughter always hit her. She stood in the doorway for a single moment, her back straight, and let it pass through. Walt Pruitt, to his modest credit, said nothing. He just counted out her change and handed it over, and when she met his eyes, he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "You settling in all right?" he asked. A different tone from his wife's version, genuinely asking. "Well enough," she said. "Mountains no joke in winter." "No," she agreed. It isn't. She loaded the rest of the supplies, untied the bay, and started toward the road. She had almost reached the edge of town when Tommy Pruitt, the 16-year-old standing with two boys his age outside the feed store, said something she caught only the tail of, something about her weight, and something about Rowan, and the boys all laughed. She stopped the horse. She sat there for a moment. Then she turned the mare, walked her back to where the boys stood, and stopped in front of them. Tommy's laughter died. The other two went still. Tommy Pruitt, she said. He looked up at her. He was 16 and stupid and just now frightened, which was appropriate. Father has told you about what a man is supposed to be, she said, but your father seems decent enough, so I'm going to assume he didn't teach you this. She looked at him evenly. You've got time to be better than this. Most people do. Use it. She turned the horse and rode out of Coldridge. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the mountain road, where no one could see them. Rowan was in the barn when she got back. She unsaddled the mare herself and brought the supplies into the house and was putting them away when she heard him come in. She didn't say anything about Coldridge. He didn't ask. He poured a coffee, put a cup in front of her, sat across the table. Storm coming, he said. 3 days, maybe. How bad? Could be significant. He wrapped his hands around his cup. We'll need to bring the animals in tighter. Check the wood stock. I'll do the wood this afternoon if you want to start on the animals. He nodded. Then, how is town? She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee, but his jaw was doing that thing it did. Fine, she said. He looked up, held her eyes for a second. All right, he said. She knew he knew it hadn't been fine. He knew she knew he knew, and neither of them said anything else because she didn't need him to go down the mountain and make it worse. And he understood that without being told, and that understanding, quiet, mutual, requiring no performance, felt like something neither of them had had before. Outside, the first fingers of cloud were coming down from the peaks. The storm was on its way. The storm hit on the second night, not the third, as Rowan had predicted. The mountain had its own schedule and didn't consult anyone about it. Mara woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of wind doing something she hadn't heard wind do before, a low, continuous pressure against the walls, and understood immediately that the 3 days of preparation had been compressed into 2. She was dressed and in the kitchen before Rowan came down from the loft. He found her pulling on her coat, the lantern already lit on the table. He looked at her. He looked at the lantern. He said, Animals. I know, she said. They went out together into something that wasn't quite a blizzard yet, but was working on it. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. Not the biting cold of a clear night, but the wet, heavy cold of a storm that had moisture in it, the kind that got inside clothing and stayed. The snow was coming sideways. She could see maybe 15 feet in front of her. Rowan had a rope tied from the house door to the barn, which she had not known about, and which she understood immediately was exactly the kind of practical foresight that kept people alive up here. They worked without needing to talk about it much. She took the chickens, moving them into the sectioned area of the barn they'd prepared. He moved the horses. Both of them worked on the sheep together. The sheep, being sheep, had opinions about the storm and about being relocated, and the next 20 minutes involved more chaos than either of them had planned for. One ewe got out of the pen, made it halfway to the tree line before Fletcher materialized from the dark and turned her back, and Mara, running after them in snow that was now at her ankles, lost her footing on a patch of ice and went down hard on her left knee. She got up. The knee hurt seriously. She kept going. By the time they had all the animals in, the snow was at mid-calf and still coming. They came back into the house and Mara went straight to the wood stove to get the feeling back in her hands. And it was only when she put weight on her left leg in a specific way and made an involuntary sound that Rowan looked at her directly. What happened? I fell, near the tree line when the ewe got out. Fell how? Ice. Hard. She looked at her knee. Couldn't see much through the trousers, but the way it was throbbing had a particular quality she didn't love. I don't think anything's broken. He pulled a chair from the table. Sit. The instruction was plain enough and she was tired enough that she didn't argue about it. She sat. He crouched in front of her without ceremony, and she understood he was going to check the knee, which was a kind of practical intimacy that neither of them had navigated before. She didn't make it a moment. He pressed carefully. Not gentle exactly, but careful, in the way someone was careful when they were trying to learn something from what their hands were telling them. Tell me where it hurts more. There, she said, when his thumb found the right spot. And Nothing's grinding. No. He sat back on his heels, bruised, possibly something pulled. You'll know more in the morning. He stood, went to the cold storage room off the kitchen, came back with a cloth that he'd packed with snow from the bucket by the door. He held it out. She took it and pressed it to her knee without being told why, because she already knew. Thank you, she said. He made the coffee. She noticed he made it stronger than usual, which she was starting to understand was his version of acknowledging that something had been hard. She didn't comment on it. She just drank it, and the warmth went through her in a way that was almost violent after the cold. And outside the storm pressed on the windows and the house held. This happens often? She asked. Often enough. He sat across from her, hands around his cup. My father used to say the mountain has 3 seasons. Spring, which is short. Summer, which is shorter. And winter, which is everything else. It was the most he'd said about his father unprompted. She waited, but he didn't add anything. Just looked at his coffee with that particular inward expression that meant he was somewhere she didn't have access to yet. She let it be. The storm lasted 4 days. They did not run out of things to occupy themselves. The animals needed tending even in the worst of it. The house needed managing. The wood stove needed feeding every few hours through the night. On the second day, Mara's knee had gone stiff and purple in a spectacular way, and Rowan said nothing about it but rearranged the morning's work without comment, so that what required the most walking fell to him. She noticed. She let him do it without turning it into a conversation. On the third day, when the wind had dropped enough that the silence felt loud, Rowan started repairing a harness at the kitchen table. Mara had her notebook out, the one with the maps and the trap records, and was adding to it, the annotations getting more detailed as she accumulated information about the land. She glanced up and found him watching her write. You could just ask, she said without looking up again. Ask what? Whatever you're turning over in your head. I was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd decided not to. Then, where did you learn to do all of it? The tracking, the water reading, all of it. She finished the line she was writing. Put the pen down. My father's farm was failing for the last 3 years of his life. We couldn't afford to hire anyone, so I figured out what needed figuring out. She looked up. Necessity is a very effective teacher. That's one way. What's another? Having someone who doesn't mind taking the time. She understood he meant his father. The way he said taking the time had a quality to it. Not grief exactly, more like an old bruise in a place you forgot about until you pressed it. She thought about asking. She thought about the several things she still didn't know about Rowan Creed, the spaces in what she understood about him that she'd been carefully not pushing at. She said, He taught you everything up here. Near enough. And your mother? Left when I was 4. I don't remember her clearly. He said it the way he said most things. Straight, without decoration, without inviting pity. Mine died when I was 9, Mara said. I remember her very clearly, which I think might be harder in some ways. He looked at her steadily. Yeah, he said. I think it probably is. The harness lay still on the table between them. Outside, the storm was finally losing its argument with the mountain, the wind pulling back, the snow settling. She would have liked this, Mara said, and she hadn't meant to say it out loud, but she had. Your mother. She liked people who did what they said they'd do. Mara looked at her notebook. She didn't have much patience for the other kind. And your father? How was the other kind, mostly? She said it without bitterness. Just a fact. He was a good man who had trouble doing what he said he'd do. They balanced each other out while she was alive. After, she stopped. Picked the pen up again. After, it was a different situation. Rowan set down the harness. He folded his hands on the table, and she saw them for a moment as separate from him. Large, work-scarred, the knuckles that had met hard things. You took care of him, he said. It wasn't a question. I tried to. That's a lot of weight for one person. She met his eyes. You'd know something about that. The corner of his mouth moved. Not the laugh she'd heard that one evening. Something quieter. Suppose I would, he said. That was the conversation that moved something, though she couldn't have said exactly what or how much. It was small, like most things that mattered were small. But she felt it, a slight giving, somewhere in the structure of the distance between them, like ice that had been frozen solid, shifting just enough underfoot to remind you it was still water underneath. The storm broke on the 4th morning. The sky came out blue and merciless. The kind of blue you only got at altitude after a major storm had scoured everything clean, and the snow lay deep and unmarked across the whole of the homestead. The peaks above them cut hard against that sky like something drawn in ink. Mara stood in the doorway with her coffee and looked at it, and felt something she had not expected to feel, here of all places. She didn't have a clean word for it. Something adjacent to peace, but with more weight in it. Rowan came to stand beside her. They stood there together for a moment, not saying anything, and that was all right. Then he said, "Trapline's going to be buried." "I know. Going to take 2 people." "I know that too," she said. He went to get his coat. The damage from the storm turned out to be manageable, if significant. 3 fence sections down on the east side, which was bad but not catastrophic. One of the barn's secondary roof sections had taken damage from the weight of snow accumulating over 4 days and had partially collapsed inward. Nothing that had hurt the animals, but it would need serious work before the next major snow came through. 2 of the far traps were buried beyond finding until the snowpack settled. 1 tree had come down across the access trail and would need clearing before they could get the wagon through. They made a list. Not together exactly. He had his accounting, she had hers. And at the table that evening, they compared them and found they'd identified most of the same things with minor differences in priority. And the minor differences were neither of their priorities wrong, just different ways of looking at the same problem. "East fence first," he said. "Storm system comes through again, we lose animals off the mountain." "Agreed." "Then the barn section." "That's a week's work, maybe more." "Then we'd better start tomorrow," she said. He almost smiled. She was getting better at catching the things that happened in his face that weren't quite the word for them, but were adjacent. "Yeah," he said, "we'd better." They started the fence the next morning. It was brutal work in deep snow, digging out post holes that had been frozen before the storm and were now under 18 inches of pack, resetting posts, restringing the wire with fingers that lost feeling in 20-minute intervals, and had to be warmed before you could trust them again to do the fine work. Mara's knee complained seriously for the first 2 days, and then settled into a dull, manageable protest that she worked around. On the second day of fence work, she heard horses on the lower trail. She straightened up. Rowan was 20 feet away, his back to the trail, working a post back into true. She looked down the slope and saw 2 riders coming up through the trees. Men she recognized from Coldridge, not well, but enough. One was named Haverford, she thought, a rancher. The other she wasn't sure of. Rowan turned when he heard the horses. The 2 men pulled up at the fence line. Haverford had that particular expression men wore when they were delivering something they'd been working up to. Mara had seen that expression enough times to know it came with a range of contents, most of them unpleasant. "Creed," Haverford said. "Haverford." Rowan set down his tools. "You're a long way from your spread. Storm brought some things to light. There's talk needed among the landholders up here." Haverford's eyes moved to Mara. They stayed there a beat too long. "Didn't realize you'd bring company." "She's not company," Rowan said. His voice hadn't changed at all. Same flat, plain register. "She lives here. You can say what you need to say." Haverford shifted in the saddle. He didn't look comfortable with the arrangement, but he was also apparently smart enough to pick his battles with Rowan Creed. "There's been problems south of here. Hendricks lost a section of his land, some kind of legal challenge, paperwork filed in the county seat. Before the storm came through, he's not the first." He looked at Rowan more directly now. "Word is there's a group working the mountain properties. Buying up debt, filing challenges, pushing people out. Small operations first, then they work up." Rowan was very still. "What group?" he said. "Don't have a name yet. Hendricks is trying to get paperwork from the county. But they're organized. They've been at it since spring, probably. Most of us didn't notice until the storm gave us time to compare." Mara had stopped pretending to work on the fence. She was listening with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. Land syndicate. Buying up debt and filing legal challenges. That was how you cleared a mountain of small homesteaders without needing guns. Slower, quieter, more expensive to fight. "When's the meeting?" Rowan asked. "Saturday. Habershaw's barn. You come?" Haverford's tone suggested he wasn't sure Rowan would. "I'll be there," Rowan said. Haverford nodded. His eyes went to Mara one more time, with something she couldn't quite read. Not contempt, exactly. More like adjustment. Like he was revising something he'd filed away. Then he turned his horse, and both riders went back down through the trees, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the snow. Mara looked at Rowan. "You knew something was happening," she said. Not an accusation, a read. "Suspected," he said. He picked up his tools. "Didn't have the shape of it. Now you do." "Now I do." He set the next post and picked up the driver. "Helps to know what you're actually dealing with." She watched him work for a moment. Then she picked up her own tools and went back to the fence, and her mind worked alongside her hands, turning over what Haverford had said. Buying up debt. Filing challenges. Small operations first. Rowan's homestead wasn't small, but 6,000 feet up a mountain, 3 hours from the county seat, in good weather. That was isolation, and isolation could be a vulnerability even for a man who'd made it work for him. She said, "Do you have your deed papers? Your father's original title?" He paused. "Yeah. I want to look at them." He looked at her over the fence line. That reading look again. The one that was becoming familiar. The one that took stock of her without diminishing what it found. "All right," he said. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the deed papers and a lamp pulled close, reading carefully. Legal language was not something she was formally trained in, but she had spent 2 years handling her father's farm accounts and dealing with creditors, and she had learned enough to understand the basic architecture of a land title, what it said, what it protected, where the vulnerabilities were. She found 3 things that gave her pause. Not problems exactly, not yet, but places where the language was old enough and ambiguous enough that a sophisticated legal challenge could find purchase. She wrote them down. Rowan sat across from her and said nothing while she worked. He had the dogs on either side of him, which was where they went when the night was cold. And Fletcher had his head on Rowan's knee, and Rowan had one hand on the dog's neck in the absent way of a man who didn't think of himself as needing comfort, but had arranged for it anyway. Finally, she looked up. "These 3 sections of the title," she said, and slid the paper across with her notes beside it. "If someone wanted to file a challenge, these are where they'd do it." He studied her notes. His expression shifted through several things. "My father filed these papers in 1871. The language was less precise then. It doesn't mean you'd lose a challenge. It means you'd have to fight one." She met his eyes. "You need a lawyer to look at this before Saturday. Someone you trust." "Nearest lawyer is in Harmon Falls." "How far?" "Day-and-a-half ride," she calculated. Thursday to Harmon Falls. Back by Saturday if the roads were clear. It was tight. "You should go," she said. He looked at her. Then at the homestead around them. The barn work still unfinished, the fence not fully done. The 100 things that needed his hands. "I'll be here," she said, before he could say it. I was quiet long enough that she could hear the wind picking up outside again. Just a suggestion this time, not a threat. Fletcher shifted under his hand. The lamp threw its small yellow light across the table and the papers, and the 2 of them sitting across from each other, and the homestead felt, in that moment, like a thing worth protecting. "You'd be alone up here," he said. "I've been alone before. Not at 6,000 feet with predator sign still fresh and the fence line not finished." "No," she admitted. "Not exactly like that." She held his eyes. "But you need that lawyer, Rowan. This is your land. Whatever else, it's yours, and it should stay that way." He was still looking at her, and she saw him making the particular calculation she was coming to know. The weighing of risk against necessity. The trust that didn't come easily and wasn't given lightly. "I'll leave at first light Thursday," he said. "I'll finish the east fence." "Leave the barn section." "I know my limits," she said, which was a stretch, but he let it go. He gathered the papers and folded them with the same care he brought to things he valued. Then he looked at her across the lamplight, and whatever he was going to say he didn't say, just held it for a moment, something complicated and real moving through his face. And then he called the dogs and went upstairs to the loft. Mara sat alone at this table for a while after. The lamp burned low. Outside, the mountain was cold and dark and patient, the way it always was, waiting to see what the people on it were made of. She thought she was starting to find out. Rowan left before the sky was fully light. Mara stood in the doorway and watched him go, the dark shape of him on horseback moving down through the snow-heavy pines, Fletcher and Dunn sitting on either side of her in the cold like sentinels, and then the trees closed behind him, and there was just the mountain and the pale gray morning and the list of things she needed to do. She went inside and made coffee and sat with it for exactly 5 minutes. Then she put on her coat and went to work. The east fence took most of Thursday. The snow had settled overnight and was firmer underfoot, which helped, but the last two sections were the worst. A corner post that had been stressed before the storm and had come all the way out of the frozen ground, and a stretch of wire that had snapped under the weight of snow accumulation and needed replacing from the spool in the barn. She did it wrong the first time. She knew she'd done it wrong when she stepped back and saw the tension was off, that the wire had a sag in it that would be a problem, and she said something she wouldn't have said with company present and pulled the whole section and did it again. It took her until the light started going gray to get it right. She came in, fed the animals, made something quick and not very good out of what was available in the kitchen, and sat at the table with her notebook. Her hands hurt. Her knee had gone past protest into a dull, constant conversation she was trying not to engage with. She ate and made notes and tried not to think about what Rowan was or wasn't finding in Harmon Falls. Fletcher pushed the door open from where she'd latched it improperly and walked in and settled himself across her feet, which she allowed because she was tired and because the warmth was not nothing. She slept heavily that night and didn't dream, which was a mercy. Friday she did the remaining trapline sections. The two that had been buried were still inaccessible under the new pack, and she marked them in her notebook with a note to return after the weekend's thaw. She found sign of the mountain lion again, further north this time, which tracked with the territory shift she'd recorded after their tracking session together. She noted it, didn't follow it, came back. Friday afternoon she heard riders again. Two of them, coming up the trail, but not from the lower road, from the eastern slope, which was the Haverford approach, and made her pause on the barn steps with a particular alertness. She waited. The riders came out of the trees and she recognized one of them as Haverford. The second was a woman, mid-40s, trail-hardened, with the face of someone who had made enough hard decisions that they'd stopped being difficult. She had a rifle across her saddle in the practiced way of a person who kept it there as casually as a hat. "Mrs. Creed," Haverford said, which was the first time anyone had called her that, and the sound of it landed strangely. "Haverford," she said. "Rowan's in Harmon Falls." "I know, that's why we came now." He dismounted. "This is Clara Briggs. She runs the Briggs operation north of here, up near the second ridge." Clara Briggs looked at Mara with a directness that was different from the settlement's kind of looking. Not assessing for weakness, assessing for something else. "Heard about you," she said. "Heard you stayed up here through the storm alone while Creed went for the lawyer." "He's not back yet," Mara said, "so I'm still staying up here alone." Something shifted in Clara's face. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition of a particular quality in another person. "Fair enough," she said. "You got coffee?" They came in and sat at Mara's table, and the conversation they had was not the conversation she'd expected. Haverford had more information since their fence line meeting. He'd been in contact with two other landholders on the eastern slope, men named Garrison and Pell. And between them, they had constructed a clearer picture of what was happening. The group working the mountain properties was operating through a shell arrangement in the county seat, filing challenges and buying debt through intermediary names that were hard to trace back to anyone central. They'd already absorbed two smaller operations south of Coldridge, properties that had been marginal to begin with, whose owners had taken the buyout because the alternative was a legal fight they couldn't afford. "Hendricks got a letter," Haverford said. "Legal language, all proper. Said there was a lien on record against the original 1869 title that had never been discharged. Hendricks says he's never heard of any such lien. His family's been on that land 40 years. "They invent the lien?" Mara asked. "Can't prove it yet. But Garrison thinks, and he's not stupid, Garrison, he thinks they're working through old county records, finding gaps, places where the documentation from 20-30 years back was incomplete, and building something into the gap." Mara thought about the 3 sections she'd flagged in Rowan's title papers. The places where the language from 1871 was old enough and imprecise enough to offer purchase to someone who knew what they were looking for. "How many operations are they targeting?" she asked. "That we know of? 7? That we suspect?" Haverford exchanged a look with Clara. "Most of the mountain." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a sound she was becoming fluent in. This was the easy register, not a threat, just the mountain breathing. Clara had been watching Mara throughout the conversation with that same considering attention. Now she said, "You looked at Creed's papers." "I did. And?" "There are 3 sections of the title that would be vulnerable to the kind of challenge you're describing, which is why he went to Harmon Falls." Clara nodded slowly. "Mine has 2, she said. I found them myself. 3 days after Haverford came to see me. I've been dealing with my own paperwork for 20 years. I know where the soft spots are. Does everyone going to Saturday's meeting know what they're actually walking into? Mara asked. Haverford made a face. Some of them know there's a problem. Not all of them understand how organized it is. They need to understand, Mara said. If they walk in thinking this is a dispute to be talked out with a neighbor, and it's actually a coordinated legal assault on their property rights, they're going to make bad decisions. She thought about it. Who's running the meeting? Habershaw. His barn. He suggested it. What do you know about Habershaw? Haverford looked slightly uncomfortable. He's been on the mountain 12 years. Decent enough man. Has he had any contact with the syndicate people? Any letters? Any visits? The slight discomfort deepened. I don't know. That's the first thing you need to know before Saturday, Mara said. Not an accusation. But if someone in your group of landholders is in contact with the other side and feeding them information about who's organizing, who's vulnerable, who's talking to lawyers, that changes the meeting considerably. Clara was looking at her with open attention now. You think like someone who's been through this kind of thing, she said. I've been through a smaller version of it, Mara said. Creditors working a failing farm, different scale, same principle. They count on you not understanding what they're doing until it's too late to organize against it. Haverford sat back in his chair. He had the look of a man rearranging internal furniture. We need to talk before Saturday, he said. The landholders who we trust, Garrison, Pell, Clara. You and Creed, if he's back in time. He'll be back, Mara said, with more certainty than she actually had. Could we meet here? Friday evening. He looked around the kitchen, and whatever he'd expected to see in Rowan Creed's kitchen, Mara couldn't guess at the exact content of his expectations, seemed to have been revised. This is further up than Habershaw can see from his ridge. Mara thought about the state of the kitchen, the limited seating, the fact that she had not been consulted about turning the homestead into a planning session for mountain land holders. She thought about Rowan, who had not asked her before accepting the arrangement that brought her here, and who had also been the only one who saw something worth seeing when everyone else was busy laughing. Tomorrow evening, she said. 6 o'clock. I'll have food. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Good, in the tone of someone who didn't use the word carelessly. They left when the light started going, heading back down the eastern slope, and Mara stood in the doorway again and watched them go. And this time the feeling in her chest was different from the morning she'd watched Rowan leave. Less like being left, more like something gathering. Rowan came back Saturday morning earlier than she'd expected. She heard the horse and was outside before he'd dismounted, and he looked at her face and said, What happened? Nothing bad, she said. A lot happened. Come inside. She told him while he took off the trail coat and washed his face and poured coffee. Told him about Haverford and Clara, about the scope of the syndicate operation as they now understood it, about the meeting planned for that evening, about her concerns regarding Habershaw. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to things he considered important. Habershaw, he said when she finished. I don't know. I'm not saying he's in with them. I'm saying we don't know. He's been pushing people to consolidate their eastern fence lines for 2 years, Rowan said slowly, working through something as he said it. Said it was about predator management. Garrison never thought it made sense from a terrain standpoint. He looked at his coffee cup. If you were mapping which properties had the cleanest legal title and which had vulnerabilities, the way to find out, without looking like you were finding out, would be to get the landholders talking about their boundaries, their deeds, what they owned, and where. Mara felt it slot into place. Fence line consolidation meetings. Yeah. How many of those meetings has Habershaw organized? 3 that I know of. I didn't go to any of them. His jaw was doing that thing. I don't consolidate with neighbors. Because you don't trust them or because you prefer working alone? He looked up at her. Both, he said honestly. She sat down across from him. The lawyer in Harmon Falls? Good news and bad news, he said. Good news is that the 3 sections you flagged, he thinks 2 of them can be shored up with supplementary documentation. Filing process is straightforward if we move fast. Bad news is the 3rd one. He paused. The northeastern corner of the property. The boundary survey from 1871 used a landmark that doesn't exist anymore. A particular rock formation, apparently. Collapsed in a landslide sometime in the 1880s. Without the physical landmark, the written description is ambiguous. How ambiguous. Ambiguous enough that if someone filed a challenge on the northeastern boundary, there would be a real legal argument. He folded his hands on the table. The lawyer wants $200 to file the supplementary documentation and prepare a defensive position on the northeastern section. And he wants it before the end of the month, because if the syndicate has been working through county records, it's only a matter of time before they find the same things you found. $200. Mara didn't ask if he had it. She had come to understand enough about the homestead's finances to know that $200 was not available money, not after the equipment costs from fall and the supplies that had to be brought up before the winter roads closed. Clara Briggs mentioned a joint legal defense arrangement, she said carefully, if the landholders who are organized pool resources for legal costs. She didn't say the number, but she's thinking along those lines. Rowan absorbed this. I don't pool resources. I know. It means obligations, entanglements. It means surviving this, she said. Alone, on $200 you don't have readily, against a syndicate with county-level connections and a 2-year head start. Those are not good odds, Rowan. He was quiet. She watched him work through it, watched the independence and the wariness do battle with the part of him that was, underneath everything, a practical man. The meeting tonight, he said finally. Let me hear what Clara says about the arrangement. That's all I'm asking, she said. 6 people came that evening. Haverford, Clara Briggs, Garrison, a quiet man named Pell, who said almost nothing but listened with an intensity that suggested he was retaining every word, and a woman named Ruth Kindler who ran a sheep operation on the western slope, and who had brought, unrequested, a covered dish of something warm that turned out to be a bean and salt pork situation that was significantly better than what Mara had managed. Habershaw was not invited. This was not discussed until Garrison asked where he was, and Rowan said, "Not here," in a tone that closed the subject. Garrison looked at Haverford, who gave the smallest possible nod, and Garrison let it go. They talked for 3 hours. The kitchen got warm with bodies, and the lanterns turned it amber, and outside the mountain was dark and cold and patient, and inside these people who spent most of their lives not trusting each other were working through the mathematics of a threat they couldn't fight separately. It was not a comfortable conversation. Garrison and Pell disagreed about the legal strategy. Clara and Haverford had a pointed exchange about who had authority to make decisions on behalf of the group that got loud for a few minutes before settling. Ruth Kindler said very little, but when she spoke, people listened, which was a particular kind of power that Mara recognized and respected. Mara mostly listened too. She spoke twice, once to lay out what she understood about the syndicate's method, plainly and without drama, using the documentation she'd been gathering and the pattern analysis she'd done in the last 2 days. The room got quiet, while she talked in a way that was different from the quiet of Coldridge. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of people who were paying attention because what they were hearing was useful. The second time she spoke was near the end, when the conversation was threading toward falling apart over the question of financial pooling. You don't have to like each other, she said. You don't have to trust each other beyond what's necessary. What you need to agree on is whether this land matters enough to do something uncomfortable to keep it. She looked around the table, because separately, most of you lose. Together, you have a real argument. That's the whole of it. The room was quiet for a moment. Rowan was looking at her from across the table. She caught his eyes and held them for a second, and in that second there was something communicated that had no words and didn't need them. Clara Briggs put her hands flat on the table. I'm in for the pooled arrangement, she said. My number is $60 toward the joint legal costs. Garrison said, 50. Pell held up 3 fingers. 30. Ruth Kindler said, 40, and I'll handle the paperwork coordination because I have the clearest hand. Haverford said, 70. I've got the most to lose. Everyone looked at Rowan. He had his arms folded, looking at the table. The particular lockdown stillness of a man fighting his own nature. Then he uncrossed his arms, put his hands flat like Clara had, and said, 60. The number in the room was enough. Clara wrote it down. They talked for another hour about the Saturday meeting at Habershaw's. What to say, what not to say. Whether Habershaw would show his hand or whether Mara's suspicion was just suspicion. They agreed to go, to say less than they knew, and to watch how Habershaw directed the conversation. People left in ones and twos back into the dark mountain, and Mara stood at the door and felt the cold coming in and watched the lantern lights move down through the trees until they were gone. Rowan came to stand beside her. You organized that, he said. Haverford organized it. He got the people to the table, Rowan said. You made it work. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out into the dark, the way he looked at the mountain, with the steadiness of a man who didn't flinch from what was actually there. I wouldn't have done the pooled arrangement without you. I want you to know that. She thought about several responses. I know, she said, which was honest. He turned and went back inside without saying anything else, and she stood there for another moment, alone in the cold doorway, with the mountain huge and dark around her, and something in her chest was doing something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She didn't name it, she just let it be. But she didn't go in right away. She stood there in the cold and the dark, and she thought about a woman in Clement Falls who had been told, in 100 different ways and by 100 different people, that she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. And she thought about 6 people sitting at a table on a mountain at 6,000 feet, listening. She finally went inside and latched the door. The lamp was still burning in the kitchen. Rowan had left it. She understood, somehow, that he'd done it on purpose. Left the light on so she wouldn't come in from the dark to nothing. She sat down at the table with her notebook and started writing down everything she could remember about the conversation. Every number, every name, every hesitation that had told her something. She wrote until the lamp started guttering, and then she went to bed, and for the first time since she had arrived on this mountain, she fell asleep without the specific cold weight of not knowing whether any of this was going to work. She still didn't know. But it felt now like a question worth fighting over. The meeting at Habershaw's barn was on a Saturday, and by the time Mara and Rowan rode down through the snow-heavy pines to the valley floor, she had already decided she was going to say as little as possible and watch everything. Habershaw's spread sat on the lower eastern slope. Not mountain land exactly, more like the transition zone where the terrain softened and the timber thinned and the soil got good enough to run cattle without fighting the grade every season. The barn was large, well-maintained, which told you something. A man who kept his barn that well either had money or was trying to look like he did. Mara filed it away. There were already 8 horses at the rail when they arrived. Haverford's bay was there. Clara's distinctive gray. Others she didn't recognize. She counted faces as they went in. 11 people total, including a man she didn't know standing near the far wall, who had the particular stillness of someone who was observing rather than participating. He wasn't a landholder. She could tell that much from the cut of his coat and the way he held himself, like someone accustomed to rooms where other people did the nervous shuffling. She didn't point him out to Rowan. He'd already seen him. She could tell by the angle of Rowan's head. Habershaw was a broad man in his 50s with a gray beard and the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned early that people trusted a man who smiled with his whole face. He shook hands with Rowan and said, "Creed, glad you came, and this must be your wife." His eyes went to Mara the way eyes always went to her in a room. That sliding assessment, looking for the thing they expected to find and finding something that didn't quite fit the category. "Mara Whitlock," she said, because she still used her own name when she introduced herself. She hadn't discussed this with Rowan. He hadn't mentioned it. Habershaw's smile stayed in place. "Come in, get warm. We've got a lot to talk about." They found spots near Haverford and Clara, and the meeting began the way these things always began, slowly, with people establishing their grievances in the particular order of who talked loudest. Habershaw let the room run for a while, which was technique, Mara noted. Let people feel heard before you direct them somewhere. Then he started directing. "What we need," Habershaw said, settling into the center of the room the way a man did when he'd been planning to settle there for a while, "is to understand the scope of the threat and make decisions about how we respond. And I think the smartest response, given the legal complexity involved, is a coordinated sale." The room shifted. Not loudly. A collective exhale, a few exchanged looks. "A sale," Garrison said flatly. "A negotiated sale, coordinated terms. Better than a forced legal loss." Habershaw spread his hands, the gesture of a reasonable man making reasonable points. "We fight this in court. We spend money we don't have on lawyers who can't guarantee outcomes. Or we negotiate from a position of collective strength. Get a fair price, get out ahead of it." Pell said very quietly. "Fair price from who?" "The group that's been filing the challenges," Habershaw said. "They're not the enemy. They're businessmen. I've had preliminary conversations. You've been talking to them." Claire's voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a blade through cold water. "How long?" Habershaw's smile didn't waver, but something underneath it did. "Preliminary conversations. As I said, trying to understand the situation from all angles. And they offered you what? Clara said. To get us into a room. The silence that followed was the kind Mara had learned to read. Not the silence of people digesting something, but the silence of people sitting with something they'd suspected and were now watching confirmed in real time. Habershaw's jaw moved. The smile finally came down, just slightly, revealing the structure beneath it. This is about everyone's best interest. The legal situation is difficult. The legal situation, Rowan said, is something most of us have talked to lawyers about. He said it from where he stood near the wall. Hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, but the room turned toward him with the particular attention rooms gave men who spoke rarely and then meant it. Habershaw looked at him and something moved behind his eyes. Creed? You organized 3 fence line meetings in 2 years, Rowan said. Got landholders talking about their boundaries, their titles, their weak spots. He wasn't accusing. He was stating, the way you stated facts that didn't require embellishment. And now you're telling us the best option is a coordinated sale to the people who've been filing legal challenges based on those weak spots. The room was very still. I'm telling you it's an option, Habershaw said, and the warmth in his voice had gone to something flatter, one of several. I want to know the man's name, Clara said. She was looking at the stranger near the far wall. The one you brought. The stranger's stillness didn't change. He was good at this. That careful neutrality of someone who'd been in confrontational rooms before, and had learned to let other people do the confronting. He said, My name is Aldrich. I represent the Consolidated Mountain Development Corporation. Who owns it? Garrison said. That's a matter of public corporate record at the county seat. Which is a way of not answering, Garrison said. Aldrich's expression didn't shift. I'm prepared to discuss terms for a coordinated purchase. You should leave, Mara said. She said it quietly, which was perhaps why the room registered it the way it did. Several heads turned toward her. Aldrich looked at her for the first time. That assessing look, calibrating what he was seeing, deciding how much weight to assign it. Ma'am, you came to this meeting without being invited by the people whose land is being discussed, she said. Habershaw invited you, which tells us what we needed to know about Habershaw. But you don't represent anyone in this room, and you never did. And I think you should leave and let the people who actually own this mountain talk among themselves. Aldrich looked at Habershaw. Habershaw looked at the floor. The calculation Aldrich was running was visible on his face. Whether pressing the point served any purpose, whether the room had already turned past where he could redirect it. He picked up his hat from the post beside him. I'll be at the Coldridge Inn through Monday, he said, to the room generally. The offer is time-sensitive. Anyone who wants to discuss terms is welcome. He walked out, and the barn door closed behind him, and the sound of his horse leaving faded up the road. The room turned to Habershaw. Habershaw said, I'm trying to protect everyone here. By selling us out, Ruth Kindler said. It was the first thing she'd said, and she said it without heat, just as a clarification. By finding a realistic solution? Here's what's realistic, Clara said. She opened the document she'd been holding, rolled in her fists since she arrived. Ruth's neat handwriting, the pooled legal defense arrangement they'd drafted Friday night at the Creed homestead. She set it on the nearest crate flat. 7 landholders on this mountain have retained joint legal counsel in Harmon Falls, have documented the syndicate's pattern of title challenges, and have filed supplementary documentation on 3 properties this week. That's the realistic situation. She looked at Habershaw. How much did they offer you? That's not how much. Habershaw's face went through several things. Anger first, then a kind of deflation that was almost pitiable, and then finally something that looked like it was trying to be dignity and wasn't quite making it. Enough to clear my debts and have something left over, he said. That's how much. The room let that sit. The room let. Nobody said anything cruel. Mara had half expected someone to, Garrison, maybe, who had the sharp edges of a man who'd been lied to before and didn't forgive it quickly. But the silence that followed was something more complicated than cruelty. It had the weight of people understanding that debt could turn a man, that desperation had a shape, that Habershaw standing in his own barn having just been exposed was already a punishment that didn't need adding to. Rowan said, Come to the lawyer with the rest of us or don't. That's your decision. He moved toward the door. Meeting's over. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a resolution. It was Rowan Creed, who'd never been a man for theater, calling the thing what it was and walking out. And because he walked, the others followed. and Habershaw was left standing in his barn with the remains of what he'd built. They were halfway back up the mountain when the snow started again. Not a storm, not yet, but the particular quiet, serious snowfall that meant the sky had made a decision and wasn't asking for input. Mara pulled her coat tighter and kept the mare at a steady pace behind Rowan's horse, and the pines closed around them, and the settlement disappeared below. "You told Aldrich to leave," Rowan said without turning around. "Someone had to." "I was going to." "I know," she said. "I was closer." She heard something from him that might have been a short sound of amusement. In the snow and the pine-filtered light, it was hard to be certain. They didn't speak again until the homestead came into view. The days that followed had a different quality. Something had shifted in the dynamic of the mountain, not just between Mara and Rowan, but among the landholders who had sat together in Habershaw's barn and come out the other side of it, knowing something they hadn't known going in. There was a correspondence now, an actual network of people who shared information, notes brought by writers, updates from Harmon Falls as the lawyer worked through the filing process, intelligence about Aldrich's movements and who he was talking to. Ruth Kindler turned out to be extraordinarily good at coordinating this. Her neat handwriting moved up and down the mountain in the saddlebags of various riders, and what had been a scattered group of isolated homesteaders began, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable friction, to function like something resembling an alliance. Mara found herself at the center of more of it than she'd expected. People sent notes to Rowan's address, but they were increasingly addressed to both of them, or sometimes to her specifically. Clara asking for her read on a legal development, Garrison wanting to talk through a concern about the eastern fence consolidation, Ruth checking a detail about the pattern analysis Mara had laid out at the kitchen meeting. She managed it from the kitchen table, mostly. Her notebook getting dense with cross-referenced information, the correspondence organized by date and subject in a system she'd built from what was available, which was string and patience and a good memory. Rowan watched this happening without commenting on it directly. He said once, "You're doing the work of 3 people," and she said, "It's one thing that needs doing." And he looked at her with that reading look and went back to what he was doing. But there were evenings now that were different from the early weeks. The formal, careful distance had compressed into something smaller, something that still had edges but no longer felt like a barrier. He told her things about the mountain, not instructionally, the way he'd first shown her things, but conversationally, the way a person talked about a place they loved to someone they expected would understand. The south-facing bench above the tree line where deer came in spring. The spring that ran clear year-round because it came from deep enough underground to stay above freezing. His father's grave on the eastern slope, marked by a cairn he'd built himself. She told him things, too, about Clement Falls. The real texture of it, not the summary. The particular misery of a failing farm and a father who couldn't stop it. The way she'd spent 2 years being practical and capable and absolutely furious on the inside at a situation she'd had no hand in making but had to solve anyway. And then the ad in the back of a publication she'd found at the post office. Mail order arrangements, mountain settlements, men seeking wives. And the 3 weeks she'd spent arguing with herself about whether she was desperate enough to try it before acknowledging she wasn't desperate, just ready to go somewhere else and be something else. Somewhere that didn't already have a story written about who she was. "You read the ad and you thought mountain wilderness," Rowan said, with that almost quality that was close to dry humor. "I thought somewhere with no prior expectations," she said. "The mountain wilderness was incidental." "Did it work out?" She considered the question seriously. "Ask me in the spring," she said, the corner of his mouth. "Fair." It was on a Wednesday in the deep part of February that the second storm came. She knew it before the sky confirmed it. The animals knew first, the way animals always knew, the particular restlessness in the barn that evening, the dogs refusing to settle. She told Rowan at supper, and he went out to check the sky and came back in and said, "Tomorrow morning, maybe tonight. Big. Could be worse than November." They spent the evening preparing with the efficiency of people who'd done it before and knew exactly what each of them was doing. She didn't need to be told what to handle. He didn't need to explain the sequence. They moved through the homestead and the barn in the kind of parallel work that had become natural, not choreographed, not without occasional collision or miscommunication, but functional in the real way that mattered when the weather was making decisions. It hit at 3 in the morning, not gradually. The mountain storms didn't do gradual when they meant business. They arrived with the full weight of what they were, the wind coming down off the peaks in a way that made the house sound like it was working, the deep structural sounds of log walls taking pressure. Mara was awake at the first impact of it, which was a sound she felt more than heard, a change in the quality of the air itself. She was in her coat and at the door when Rowan came down from the loft. "Worse than November," he said. "Yes," she agreed. This storm was different in a specific way. The wind had a direction to it, hard out of the northwest, which drove the snow horizontally rather than down, and meant that the barn door, which faced northwest, was going to have serious problems. They discovered this when Rowan tried to open it, and the wind had packed snow against the base a foot deep in the hours since they'd checked. They dug it out together, in the dark, with the lantern barely reaching 3 feet in any direction, the wind trying to take it twice before Mara got the cover adjusted properly. She dug, and he dug, and they got the door open and got inside, and the animals were frightened, the sheep especially, moving in the tight, anxious patterns of animals that had heard the storm coming in and had been working themselves up about it for hours. Mara went to the sheep. She didn't think about it particularly. She just moved to where the problem was, the way she'd learned to do. She got among them, moved slowly, talking in the low, continuous register that she'd discovered worked. Not words exactly, just sound and presence, and the message that something living and calm was here, and the panic could stand down. Rowan was with the horses, which had their own agenda. It took 40 minutes to get the animals settled. By the end of it, she was sweating inside her coat, and her knee, which had been improving steadily, had found a new way to communicate its objections, a sharp particular pain when she stepped wrong on the uneven barn floor. She stepped wrong twice. Made the sound once, controlled it the second time. They came back into the house, and the storm was fully running now, the house a small island of light and heat in the middle of something vast and indifferent. She sat at the kitchen table and pulled off her gloves, and her hands were not in good shape, the cold having done something to the joints that would make the next hour uncomfortable. Rowan put the kettle on without being asked. He put her gloves near the stove to dry. He sat across from her and he looked at her hands on the table and he said, "How's the knee?" "Educational," she said. He almost smiled. Then his face settled into something more serious. "You should have said when you stepped wrong. We were managing the animals. I heard you the first time, not the second." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to manage what hurts in front of me." She met his eyes. This kitchen was warm and the storm was loud outside, and they had been living in the same house for 3 months, and she understood him considerably better now than she had in November. And what she saw in his face was not pity and not performance. It was something more uncomfortable than either. "I'm not good at that," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither am I." He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm working on it." She looked at his hands. She looked at her own. The storm pushed hard against the west wall, and the lantern swung slightly on its hook and steadied. "Your father," she said. "He was sick at the end." Rowan didn't move. "Yeah. You took care of him. Tried to. And after, you were alone for 3 years, he said. "A little more." She nodded. She thought about a man alone on a mountain for 3 years with only the mountain to talk back, and the specific shape that kind of solitude carved into a person, not hollowing them out, but compressing something inward, making it dense and hard and very quiet. "I'm not going to be easy to be married to," she said, because it was true, and she believed in telling true things. "I have my own. I have edges. I don't always know when I'm being difficult versus when I'm just being myself." "Neither do I," he said. "I know." She paused. "But you left a light on," she said. "That first night, after the landholders met, you left the lamp burning in the kitchen." He was very still. "I noticed," she said. He looked at the table. His jaw moved, and then he looked up. And what was in his face was not the compressed, careful thing she'd grown accustomed to, but something more open, more unguarded, and more human. The face of a man who had been trying to hold himself at a distance from something, and had finally run out of ground to stand on. "I didn't want you coming in from the cold to nothing," he said. "That's all it was." "I know that's all it was," she said. "That's why I'm telling you I noticed." The storm ran all night. They sat in the kitchen for another hour, and then another, not because there was more to do, but because neither of them moved to end it, and the conversation moved through things neither of them had said to another person in a long time. Not dramatic things, not confessions, just the real texture of two lives that had been shaped by hard circumstances and were now, improbably, in the same room on the same mountain in the same storm. At some point, Fletcher came and lay down between their chairs, and Dunn took the floor near the stove, and the lamp burned low, and Mara got up to trim it, and Rowan got up to put more wood in the stove, and they were briefly in the same small space of the kitchen, and she was aware of the proximity and the warmth and the specific reality of him. Not the idea of him she'd been constructing from details, but the actual person, close enough that she could see the tiredness around his eyes, and the way his hair was doing something unruly from the hat he'd been wearing, and the fact that the storm had put a redness along his jaw from the cold. I was looking at her. She said, "You should sleep. If the storm breaks tomorrow, we'll have a full day of it." "You should sleep too," he said. "I will." She didn't move immediately, neither did he. Then she said, "Thank you for going to Harmon Falls for the lawyer." She paused. "For choosing this." He knew she didn't mean the lawyer. She watched him know it, watched it move through him. "I saw you get off that wagon," he said quietly, "and I saw everyone looking at you the way they were looking, and I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought that was someone who'd been looked at that way for a long time and hadn't let it make her small." He held her eyes. "I was right about that." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the silence didn't already hold. She went to bed. He went to the loft. The storm kept going, and somewhere in the dark, dense heart of that February night, the thing that had been building between them since a frozen November morning in Coldridge, since 5 words spoken to a crowd, since a woman got down off a wagon into mud and kept going, settled into something that had the weight and permanence of the mountain itself. Not finished. Nothing real was ever finished, but real, unmistakably, in the way the most important things were real, not because they were easy, but because they held. The February storm left 3 feet of new snow and a silence so complete it had texture. Mara stood at the kitchen window the morning after and watched the light come up over the eastern peaks. That particular mountain light, brutal and clean, the kind that made everything look like it had been cut from something harder than the world usually offered. She had slept 4 hours. Her knee had woken her at 5 with a complaint she couldn't argue with, and she'd lain in the dark and listened to the house settle and decided that lying still was worse than getting up. She had coffee going by the time Rowan came down from the loft. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the night of their kitchen conversation. Something slightly more open in it, something that hadn't been there before and that neither of them was making a point of. He poured coffee. He stood at the window beside her and they looked at the snow together. "Barn roof held," he said. "I heard it holding. It was loud about it. It always is." He drank his coffee. "We need to check the east fence line. Storm hit hard from the northwest. That corner section I reset last week may have gone again." "I'll go after the animals." He looked at her sideways. "Knee is functional," she said, which was not entirely dishonest if you defined functional broadly enough. "I'll take it slow." He didn't argue. He'd learned over these months that arguing with her about what she could handle was a poor use of his energy, and she'd learned that accepting help when it was offered without making it a statement was better than the alternative. They were still learning both things, imperfectly, with friction, but they were learning. The morning's work was what it always was after a major storm, systematic, physical, and without margin for distraction. She did the animals. He did the roof assessment. They met at the east fence and found what he'd predicted. The northwest corner section down again, the post not broken this time, but tilted out of true by the wind loading on the wire. They fixed it in the cold, working alongside each other in the particular rhythm they'd built over months of this. She held the post while he drove it. He held the wire spool while she tensioned. Her hand stopped working properly around the 3rd section, and she switched to using her palm instead of her fingers for the tension check, which was inelegant but effective. And Rowan watched her adapt without commenting, which was his version of respect. By midday the fence was holding, and they were back in the kitchen with the heat on full and the kind of hungry that came from 5 hours of hard physical work in deep cold. It was while she was making something out of the dried provisions, salt beef, the last of the potatoes, some dried herbs she'd brought up in October that were losing their argument with time, but still had something left in them, that the rider came. She heard the horse before she saw it, coming fast from the lower trail, which was unusual enough that she went to the window. Rowan was already at the door. The rider was young, a boy she recognized from Coldridge, one of the garrison hands, maybe 16. He pulled up hard, and the horse was breathing heavy from the pace he'd pushed it up the mountain road. "Mr. Creed," the boy said, and his voice had the breathless quality of someone carrying something urgent. "Mr. Garrison sent me. There's men at Pell's place. 3 of them. Came in this morning. They've got papers." Rowan was already reaching for his coat. "What kind of papers?" "Eviction papers, is what Mr. Pell says. Something about a prior lien discharged improperly. His wife came to Garrison's place on foot through the snow." The boy swallowed. "Mr. Pell wouldn't let them in the house, and they're camped on his land, and saying they'll be back with a sheriff's deputy by tomorrow." Mara had her coat on. Rowan looked at her. She looked back. "Pell's lawyer filing," she said. "Did it go through?" "Should have." Ruth was coordinating. Should have isn't did. She was already thinking through it. The timeline, the filing dates, what Ruth had said in her last note about the supplementary documentation. Pell's property was on the northeastern slope, furthest from Harmon Falls, and his filing had been the last one submitted because of the travel difficulty. If there had been a delay, if Aldrich's people had moved faster than expected, filed their challenge before Pell's supplementary documentation was on record at the county seat. "I need to get to Pell's," Rowan said. "We need to get to Pell's," she said, "and someone needs to ride to Clara and Garrison, not just to come, but to bring whatever documentation they have about the joint filing. If there's a deputy coming tomorrow, we need to be able to show that the legal defense is already on record." Rowan looked at the boy. "You ride to Garrison. Tell him what I just said. Bring the documents. Clara Briggs, too. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, already turning his horse. "Eat something first," Mara said, because he was 16 and had ridden hard, and the mountain didn't care about urgency when your blood sugar dropped. She handed him a piece of the salt beef through the door, and he took it with the particular surprised gratitude of a young person who hadn't expected practical consideration in the middle of an emergency. They were on horseback inside 20 minutes. The ride to Pell's spread took 45 minutes in the deep snow, pushing harder than was comfortable because the light was already past its peak and the February afternoon would go dark early. Mara's knee had a vigorous conversation with the mare's gait the entire way. She focused past it. There was a practiced quality to that now. Not suppression, just redirection. The kind of mental management you developed after enough times when the body's complaints were real, but the situation's requirements were more immediate. Pell's homestead was smaller than Rowan's, a single main structure, a compact barn, everything in tight order, the way a careful man kept things. And in the yard between the barn and the house stood 3 men. They had horses. They had a fire going in a ring of stones that they'd clearly built themselves on Pell's land without asking, which told you something about their read of the situation and their regard for the person whose property they were camped on. Pell was standing on his porch. He was a small, quiet man in his 40s, who Mara had come to understand was considerably tougher than his quietness suggested. But right now he looked like a man who had been standing his ground for 6 hours and was starting to feel the weight of it. His wife was inside. Mara could see her silhouette in the window. 2 children, she knew, young ones. The men in the yard watched Mara and Rowan ride in. The one in the middle, older, with the particular professional composure of someone hired to deliver difficult things without flinching, stepped forward. "Mr. Creed," he said, which meant he knew who Rowan was, which meant he'd done his research, which meant this was not improvised. "You're on Pell's land," Rowan said. He hadn't dismounted. "We have legal authority to—" "You have papers that assert a claim," Mara said. She had the folder she'd pulled from the homestead files before they left. Copies of the joint filing documentation, Ruth's correspondence log, the Harmon Falls lawyer's confirmation letters. She'd grabbed them automatically, the way she grabbed what was needed. "That's not the same thing as legal authority. Can I see the papers you served Mr. Pell?" The man looked at her. That familiar assessment, recalibrating, filing her in a category, deciding how much resistance she represented. She'd been looked at that way enough times that she'd stopped finding it interesting. "Ma'am, this is a legal matter between—" "I'm asking to see the papers," she said pleasantly, in the tone she used when pleasantness was the most effective available option. "If your claim is legitimate, the papers will demonstrate that. If you're not willing to let someone read them, that tells us something different." A beat. Then the man reached into his coat and produced a document. He held it out to her. She dismounted, carefully, left foot first, keeping her weight off the right landing, and took it. She read it standing in the snow in Pell's yard, with the February cold working on her face, and the 3 syndicate men watching her, and Rowan still on his horse behind her, and Pell on his porch watching all of it with the expression of a man watching something happen that he doesn't entirely understand but recognizes as being either very good or very bad for him. The document was well constructed. She gave them that. It cited a lien from 1873, supposedly filed against the original Pell title by a previous creditor and never formally discharged, the same pattern Haverford had described months ago. The language was precise. The county filing date on the challenge was February 9th. She looked at Ruth's correspondence log. The joint filing confirmation from Harmon Falls was dated February 11th, 2 days. They were 2 days late on Pell's supplementary documentation. She breathed through it, didn't show the calculation on her face, turned to the next page of the document and the next, reading carefully because rushing was how you missed things and missing things was how you lost. And there it was. Third page. The lien they were citing, the 1873 document, listed a creditor named Harrow Brothers Commercial out of a town called Sutter's Crossing. Mara read the address twice. Then she looked at the joint filing documentation, specifically at a detail that Ruth had included in her correspondence almost as an aside 3 weeks ago, a note from the Harmon Falls lawyer about the syndicate's corporate registration. Consolidated Mountain Development Corporation. Registered address at the county seat. Parent organization listed in the state commercial registry as Harrow Development Holdings. Harrow. She looked at the 1873 document again. Harrow Brothers Commercial. Same family name. Possibly coincidence. Possibly not coincidence at all. Possibly the kind of thing that happened when a corporation manufactured historical documentation to support a current legal challenge and got sloppy about the name on the invented creditor, reaching for something familiar. She turned back to the man with the professional composure. The lien you're citing, she said, filed by Harrow Brothers Commercial in 1873. She held up Ruth's correspondence log alongside the document. The corporation you represent is a subsidiary of Harrow Development Holdings. Same principles, different era, different business structure. She let that sit for a moment. If your people fabricated this 1873 document using your own family name as the fictional creditor, that's not a legal claim. That's fraud. And the evidence of it is in your own paperwork. The composure cracked. Not completely. He was professional enough to catch it. But it cracked, a visible flinch in the precise management of his expression, and that flinch told her everything she needed to know about whether she was right. Behind her, she heard Rowan dismount. He came to stand beside her, and he looked at the man, and he said nothing, which was sometimes more effective than anything that could be said. You should leave Pell's Land, Mara said. Tonight. Whatever deputy you've arranged for tomorrow, I'd think carefully about whether you want him involved in a fraud investigation rather than a property dispute. She held the document out. I'm keeping a copy of this. Your lawyer will want to know it's in our possession. The three men looked at each other. This was the moment that could go several ways. She knew that. She stood in the snow and kept her breathing even, and didn't show the part of her that was running through what happened if they didn't leave, if they pushed back, if the situation became something physical rather than legal. She had a read on Rowan. He was still and ready in the specific way of someone who had made all the decisions he needed to make about how far he would go and was waiting to find out if he had to go there. She hoped he didn't have to. The lead man took his document back. He looked at Mara for a long moment, with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but had elements of both. We'll be in touch through proper legal channels, he said. That's where we'll be, she said. They broke their camp. It took 20 minutes, done in the particular pointed silence of people registering a loss without admitting it. Their horses went down the mountain road and disappeared into the trees, and the sound of them faded, and Pell's yard was quiet. Pell came down off the porch. He was a man of few words at the best of times, and this was not the best of times, and what he did was look at Mara for a moment and then put out his hand. She shook it. You found something in the papers, he said. They got careless, she said. It happens when people are used to not being challenged. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at Rowan. I owe you. You're in the joint arrangement, Rowan said. We're all owed the same thing. Garrison and Clara arrived 40 minutes later, documents in hand, faces set for a confrontation that had already resolved. Clara read Mara's analysis of the Harrow name discrepancy and said quietly and with considerable feeling, well, that's going to Harmon Falls first thing Monday. It did. The Harmon Falls lawyer, whose name was Beaumont, A meticulous man in his 60s who had been practicing in mountain country long enough to have seen most varieties of land fraud, spent a week with the documents and then sent a letter to every landholder in the joint arrangement, and a separate letter to the county seat, and a third letter to the state commercial registry. And what happened after that happened slowly, the way legal things happened, without drama or clarity on any particular day, but accumulating over weeks into something definitive. The Consolidated Mountain Development Corporation withdrew its challenges in late March. All of them. No statement, no explanation. Just a series of formal withdrawals filed at the county seat, the legal equivalent of picking up and leaving in the night. Beaumont said he suspected the Harrow name connection had open questions they weren't prepared to answer in front of a state investigator. He also said that proving manufactured historical documentation would have taken a year of litigation they might or might not have won, and that the withdrawal was the better outcome even if it was unsatisfying. Mara thought it was satisfying enough. Aldrich left the Coleridge Inn without anyone seeing him go. Habershaw did not attend the settlement meeting in April, where the joint legal arrangement was formally concluded and the pooled funds were redistributed to cover documented costs. Nobody went to Habershaw's barn to confront him. Nobody needed to. A man who has shown the people around him what he is when tested lives inside that knowledge every day, and that is its own accounting. The settlement itself. Coleridge, the Lower Valley, the community that had laughed at a woman stepping off a wagon in November, had a harder reckoning. It didn't happen in a day. Communities didn't reckon with themselves in days, they did it in the accumulation of small moments, in the way people adjusted their behavior without ceremony or announcement, in the things that stopped being said out loud because the ground had shifted underneath them. Darlene Voss was the first, which surprised Mara more than almost anything else in the spring that followed the long winter. She came up the mountain in April, which was itself remarkable. Darlene had no business at the Creed homestead, and both of them knew it. She arrived on a Monday morning, and Mara was in the yard mending a section of the chicken coop roof when the horse came through the trees, and she stood up and looked at Darlene Voss, and Darlene Voss looked at her. "I heard what you did," Darlene said from the saddle, "at Pell's place, and the meeting that started it." Mara waited. "I've said things," Darlene said. The words came out with the particular difficulty of words that had been sitting in someone's throat for a while. "When you arrived. Things I'd not say now." She looked somewhere past Mara's shoulder. "I wanted you to know I know that." It was not a full apology. It had the shape of one without the complete architecture. Mara understood that this was probably the best available version of the thing, and that holding out for more would be both futile and beside the point. "I appreciate you coming up here to say it," Mara said. Darlene looked at her directly for a moment. A real look, not the assessing one from November. Then she turned her horse and went back down the mountain, and Mara watched her go and thought about what it cost some people to say the minimum required thing and decided to count it as what it was. Tommy Pruitt did something more unexpected. He appeared at the general store on a Saturday when Mara was in for supplies, and he walked up to her directly, in front of his father and two other people, and said, "Mrs. Creed, I was rude to you back in November. I'm sorry for it." His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, which was mortifying for him, and which Mara chose not to register. "My dad said I ought to say it." "Your dad's right," she said. "Thank you, Tommy." Walt Pruitt caught her eye from behind the counter. He gave a small nod. She gave one back. That was the whole of it. Clara Briggs came to dinner at the homestead in May and stayed 3 hours and left with a bottle of the preserves Mara had been experimenting with since February. She said at the door, "You should know that when Haverford told me about you before I met you, I expected something different." She said it with the directness that was her particular quality. "I'm glad to have been wrong." "What did you expect?" Mara asked. "Someone surviving," Clara said. "Holding on, getting through." She pulled on her gloves. "Not someone building something." Mara thought about that for a long time after Clara's horse disappeared down the mountain road. Building something. She hadn't named it that way, even to herself. She'd been thinking in the short units that hard circumstances trained you to think in. Today's problem, this week's problem, this winter's problem. But Clara was right. Mara looked at the homestead in the May light, the garden beds she'd started breaking ground on, the chicken coop that was actually keeping chickens alive at altitude, the barn repair completed in March, the notebook now filling its third volume with maps and records, and the specific intelligence of a place learned through months of paying attention. And she understood that something had been built, was being built. would need to keep being built, imperfectly, with setbacks, through seasons that would be harder than expected and some that would be easier. That was what building was. It wasn't an event. It was a decision that had to be remade every day. She found Rowan in the barn. She often found him in the barn in the later afternoon, the part of the day when the work had a particular quality of settling, the animals fed and calm, the light coming low through the gaps in the boards. He was doing something with the harness she'd seen him working on for weeks, and she came and sat on the hay bale nearby, and he kept working, and neither of them said anything for a while. Clara says we're building something, she said eventually. Clara's perceptive, he said, without looking up. Do you think she's right? He set down the harness. He looked at her, and the light was low and kind, and she could see the exhaustion in his face. That was the good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from a day of real work, rather than a day of surviving. She could see the gray at his temples that she'd stopped noticing because it had become simply part of what he looked like. She could see the thing in his eyes that she'd learned to read over a winter and a spring of daily proximity, the particular quality of his attention when it was fully on her, which was not like anyone else's attention she'd experienced. It asked nothing and held nothing back. I think we're building something, he said. It's not finished, she said. No, he agreed. Long way from finished. And there'll be another winter, she said, and the northeastern boundary is still legally ambiguous, and the animals are more work than I estimated, and I still don't entirely know what I'm doing half the time. You know what you're doing more than that, he said. More than half, less than I'd like. That's everyone, he said. That's all of it, really. Nobody knows what they're doing as much as they need to. The ones who survive are the ones who keep going anyway. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that casually. He'd meant it, had been carrying it for a while, and had found the moment for it. She thought about a woman in Clement Falls who had read an ad in the back of a publication and spent 3 weeks arguing with herself. She thought about a frozen November morning and mud and laughter and 5 words that silenced a crowd. She thought about the distance that had been between them in the beginning, not hostile, just vast. 2 people who had learned wariness as a survival skill and were slowly, carefully, with regular setbacks and miscommunications, and moments that were hard and some that were almost funny, learning something different. I didn't come here because I was desperate, she said. It was something she'd never said out loud to him, though she'd said it in her head 100 times. I know, he said. I came because I wanted somewhere I could be something else than what people already decided I was. I know that too. Do you know why you sent for me? She asked. Not an accusation, a genuine question, the kind she'd been carrying since November and hadn't found the right moment for. He picked up the harness again, but he wasn't really looking at it. I wrote to 4 different women, he said, over a year. 3 of them. I could tell from their letters that they'd be here because they needed to be somewhere. Not that that's wrong. I understand necessity. He turned the harness in his hands. Your letter was different. How? You told me what you couldn't do, he said. People trying to sell themselves don't do that. You said you'd never done serious high-altitude work, and you weren't expecting to be saved. He glanced up. I knew within 2 sentences that you weren't coming here to disappear into someone else's life. You were coming to have your own. He set the harness down. I thought I could work alongside someone like that. I didn't know if I could work alongside anyone else. She sat with that for a moment. The barn was warm with animal heat and the last of the afternoon, and outside the mountain spring was happening. The real one, not the tentative starts and retreats of March, but May's full commitment, the snow pulling back from the southern slopes to reveal ground that had been waiting underneath it all winter. You were right about being able to work alongside me, she said. Yeah, he said, I was. Don't get smug about it. The laugh, the real one, the 3-second one she'd first heard months ago at the kitchen table, came out fully this time and lasted longer. It changed his whole face. She'd been accumulating those moments all winter, and they still caught her off guard each time, the abrupt realness of him when the careful distance dropped. I'm not smug, he said. I'm relieved. Those are sometimes the same thing. Mara. What? He looked at her across the barn, in the last of the light. I'm glad you got off the wagon, he said, is what I'm saying. She thought about the moment she'd sat on the wagon bench and considered telling Carver to turn around. She thought about what would have been lost. Not just what she would have lost, but what would have remained unbuilt on a mountain at 6,000 feet, A homestead with a lamp left burning, and 2 dogs and a man who had needed someone to arrive even though he hadn't known how to say so. So am I, she said. The summer came the way mountain summers came, briefly, intensely, with a generosity that felt almost aggressive after the long winter. The garden produced better than expected. The barn roof held through the July rains. The legal documentation on the 3 title sections was finalized in August, Beaumont's letters arriving at the homestead with the specific satisfying weight of closed matters. The northeastern boundary was resolved through a resurvey process that cost money and time and patience, and ended with a legal description that would stand up to scrutiny. The mountain settlement's attention moved on to other things, the way attention did. New dramas, new difficulties, the endless work of survival in a place that didn't offer forgiveness for inattention. The woman who'd arrived wrong in November became, over months, a feature of the landscape that people stopped remarking on because she was simply there. At the supply runs, at the occasional settlement meetings, in the correspondence that moved up and down the mountain. Not invisible, not famous, just present, which was what she'd always wanted. Darlene Voss stopped saying things she'd regret. Not out of kindness necessarily, more out of the practical recalibration of a woman who had seen her read of someone turn out completely wrong and had no interest in repeating the error. Tommy Pruitt was 17 by summer and working for Garrison, and when he passed Mara on the road, he touched his hat and said, "Ma'am," and kept going. She didn't need more from him. She hadn't needed the apology for herself. She'd needed it for him, for the person he was still becoming, for the question of what kind of man he'd be when the becoming was done. What she thought about, in the end, was not the vindication. She had spent so many years bracing for the moment when the world would finally admit it had been wrong about her that when it came, quietly, undramatically, in small moments of adjusted behavior rather than any kind of announcement, she found it mattered less than she'd expected. What mattered was the morning she'd followed predator tracks into heavy timber alone, because the problem was there and needed following. What mattered was reading a land title by lamplight until the vulnerability showed itself. What mattered was standing in a stranger's yard in the snow and saying to 3 men with official papers, "That's not the same thing as legal authority." What mattered was the lamp left burning. The mountain didn't care about vindication. It cared about what you did with the cold and the dark and the work that needed doing regardless. Mara had learned that, over a winter and a spring and into a summer on a homestead at 6,000 feet, with a man who spoke plainly and left lights on, and had seen something worth seeing when everyone else was busy looking at the shape of her and deciding they already knew what was inside. She had not arrived soft. She had not been made hard by what she found here. She had arrived exactly as she was, all the edges, all the weight, all the history of being looked at wrong, and the mountain had not cared about any of it. The mountain only asked what she could do. She had answered, and on the eastern slope in the long evening light, with the peaks going amber above the tree line and Fletcher and Dunn running the far fence line and Rowan somewhere in the barn and supper still to make, and the 3rd notebook almost full and the 4th one waiting empty on the kitchen table, Mara Whitlock, who was also Mara Creed, who had sat on a wagon bench in November and almost told a driver to turn around, stood in the yard of a homestead that was hers, and looked out at a mountain that had accepted the terms she'd offered, and felt, without drama or announcement, the specific gravity of a life that had finally landed in the right place. Not perfect, not finished, not without the next difficulty already somewhere on the road, but hers. Fully, unmistakably, and at last, hers.